The dust of the Great Fire of 1835 had barely settled when Silas Vance stepped off the ferry onto the southern tip of Manhattan. He was 24, his boots were cracked, and his pockets held nothing but a set of brass drafting compasses and a letter of introduction to an architect who had died 3 days prior. The city did not care. New York in the 1830s was not a place of mourning, it was not just rebuilding, they were reinventing. The old Dutch town of low-slung wood and yellow brick was being obliterated to make way for something grander, something that could match the furious ambition of a young republic. "Watch your head, son," a voice barked. Silas leaped sideways just as a massive block of Connecticut brownstones slammed onto the dirt, kicked up by a creaking wooden derrick. The man who had shouted was older, his face mapped with deep lines and dusted with white lime. He wore a heavy wool coat despite the humidity, and his eyes were sharp, calculating the weight of the stone with a single glance. "You look like a man who's lost his master," the older man said, wiping his brow with a greasy rag. "I am," Silas replied, holding up his leather portfolio. "I was told." Isaiah Rogers needed a draftsman. The man laughed, a dry hacking sound. "Rogers is in Boston building hotels, everyone is building." "I'm Ephraim Vance, no relation I wager unless your people come from the peat bogs of Jersey. I'm a master mason. If you can draw a straight line and don't mind the smell of horse manure and wet lime, follow me. New York is growing up, boy, and it's in a hurry." That afternoon, Silas entered the world of New York architecture at its most feral stage. There were no formal licensing boards, no professional societies, no universities teaching the art of the line. There were only builders, carpenters who owned copybooks of European plates, and a few visionary madmen who looked at the swampy, rocky island of Manhattan and saw a neoclassical Rome rising from the mud. The reign of Greek fire. For the next 10 years, Silas learned the language of the Greek revival. It was an architecture born of a fierce ideological obsession. The young United States, having shaken off the British crown, rejected the Georgian and federal styles of their former masters. They looked instead to ancient Athens, the cradle of democracy. If a merchant sells flour, he wants to sell it from behind a Doric column, Ephraim would grumble as they hauled granite blocks up from the docks. If a banker holds your mortgage, he wants to look like a priest of Apollo. Silas proved to be an adept draftsman. He spent his nights by candlelight copying plates from Asher Benjamin's The Practical House Carpenter. He learned how to calculate the subtle swell, the entasis of a column, so that it wouldn't appear weak or concave to the human eye. He designed pediments for townhouses on Washington Square, where the city's elite were fleeing to escape the congestion and disease of lower Manhattan. Washington Square was the epicenter of this new, refined New York. Silas watched as row after row of red brick Greek revival townhouses marched across the former Potter's Field. They were elegant, restrained, and profoundly uniform. Each possessed a stoop of white marble or brownstone, guarded by wrought iron railings cast in the shape of acanthus leaves or Greek keys. But Silas's true baptism came with the construction of the custom house on Wall and Nassau Streets. Designed by Ithiel and Alexander Jackson Davis, with help from John Frazee, it was intended to be a fortress for the nation's wealth. More than half of the federal government's revenue was collected at the Port of New York, and the building needed to look indestructible. Silas was hired to supervise the stonecutters on the grand portico. The building was an unyielding monument of white marble from Westchester County, a material so pure it seemed to glow in the late afternoon sun. It was modeled after the Parthenon, a windowless temple of bureaucracy. "Look at those joints, Silas," Alexander Jackson Davis told him one morning, pointing up at the massive entablature. Davis was a dandy, wearing a silk cravat even on a dusty construction site, but his eye for proportion was flawless. Not a grain of mortar visible. It must look as though it were carved by the gods from a single block of stone. That is how we give this democracy permanence. Silas climbed the scaffolding, his fingers tracing the cold, smooth marble. He felt the immense weight of the stones pressing down through the foundations into the bedrock of Manhattan. It felt permanent. It felt as though New York had found its final form, a clean, white, classical republic. But New York was never meant to be permanent. It was a machine fueled by commerce, and commerce hates stagnation. The Gothic shadow and the brownstone plague. By the late 1840s, the Greek light began to fade. The city was expanding northward at a terrifying pace, pushed along the spine of Broadway by the relentless gridiron plan of 1811. That plan, which cut the island into uniform, rectangular blocks, showed no regard for topography, streams, or ancient trees. It treated Manhattan as a blank canvas for real estate speculation. As the grid marched north, the architectural mood shifted. The clean, rational lines of the Greek revival began to feel cold and pagan to a society undergoing religious revivals and romantic awakenings. In 1846, Trinity Church was completed at the head of Wall Street, designed by Richard Upjohn, an English immigrant with a devout Anglo-Catholic faith. It was a revelation. Upjohn rejected the pagan temples. He looked to the medieval cathedrals of Europe. Silas stood among the crowds on opening day, looking up at the soaring brownstone spire that pierced the sky at 281 feet. For decades, it would remain the tallest structure in New York, a dark, jagged finger pointing toward heaven, dominating the harbor. Inside, Trinity was a cavern of ribbed vaults, pointed arches, and stained glass that filtered the chaotic New York sunlight into pools of deep crimson and sapphire. It was an architecture of emotion, of mystery, and of hierarchy. The Greeks built for the earth, Upjohn told Silas during a meeting of the newly formed American Institute of Architects, which Silas had eagerly joined. The Gothic builds for the soul, the pointed arch carries the eye and the spirit upward. The success of Trinity Church triggered a massive shift in the city's fabric. Suddenly, white marble and red brick were out, brownstone was in. From the quarries of Portland, Connecticut, came an endless supply of Triassic sandstone. It was cheap, easy to carve, and when freshly cut, it possessed a rich, chocolate-brown hue that appealed to the Victorian love for somber, dignified luxury. Silas, now an independent architect with his own small office on Maiden Lane, found himself designing miles of brownstone facades. The city lost its bright, classical glow and took on a monolithic, dark appearance. "It's a plague," Ephraim, now an old man retired to a farm in the Bronx, told Silas during a visit. "That stone is soft, Silas. It's laid on its natural bedding planes to save money, but the frost will get into it. In 50 years, those beautiful carvings will be peeling off like wet cardboard." Ephraim was right, but the developers didn't care about 50 years. They cared about the next quarter. New York was transforming into a city of brownstone high-stoop row houses. Stretching through Greenwich Village into Chelsea and up toward the southern borders of the new Central Park. As the 1850s progressed, Silas began to notice a new material appearing on the docks. Not stone, not timber, but iron. Down in the industrial wards of the Lower East Side, iron foundries like James Bogartis's Dummy Works were experimenting with a radical idea. Instead of using stone to bear the weight of a building, why not use cast iron? Silas was naturally skeptical. Iron belonged in bridges and steam engines, not in civilized architecture. But curiosity drove him to Bogartis's foundry on Duane Street. There, he found a visionary who was half architect, half factory manager. Bogartis showed Silas a series of prefabricated iron components, fluted columns, ornate arches, and intricate cornices, all cast from reusable wooden molds. "Think of the economy, Mr. Vance," Bogartis shouted over the deafening clang of the foundries. "With stone, you need 100 masons chipping away for months. With iron, I can cast an entire facade in a week, bolt it together on-site in days, and it's completely fireproof. Look at this," he handed Silas a piece of iron ornament modeled after a Venetian Renaissance palace. "I can give a dry goods merchant the palace of a doge for a fraction of the cost." In 1857, the ultimate proof of this technology arrived not far from Silas's office, the E.V. Howat building on the corner of Broadway and Broome Street, designed by John P. Gaynor with cast iron elements produced by Daniel Badger's Architectural Ironworks. It was a masterpiece of the new age. Silas spent hours studying it. The building looked like a classic Italianate palazzo, but its walls were exceptionally thin, allowing for massive plate glass windows that flooded the interior retail spaces with natural light. It was an architecture designed specifically for consumer capitalism, but the Hawat building held an even greater secret inside, one that would change the shape of New York forever. On a cold March afternoon, Silas went inside to purchase some imported china for his wife. While there, he witnessed a demonstration of a new contraption installed by a man named Elisha Otis. It was a platform suspended by ropes in an open shaft designed to carry passengers to the upper floors. Silas watched as Otis stood on the platform, hauled it up to the third-floor level, and then did something unthinkable. He ordered his assistant to cut the rope with an axe. The crowd gasped. Women screamed. Silas braced himself to see a man crushed to death. The rope snapped. The platform dropped a mere few inches before a jagged safety spring engaged, locking the platform into the iron guide rails. Otis stood unharmed, tipped his hat to the crowd, and announced, "All safe, gentlemen, all safe." Silas felt a chill go down his spine. It wasn't the safety mechanism that amazed him. It was the psychological barrier that had just been shattered. Until that moment, the height of New York buildings was strictly limited by human lungs and legs. No one wanted to rent an office or an apartment above the 4th or 5th floor. The climb was too exhausting. Therefore, the city could only grow outward, spreading horizontally along the length of Manhattan. With Otis's elevator, the upper floors suddenly became the most desirable. They were filled with light, free from the street noise and the stench of horse manure. "The ground is full, Silas," he muttered to himself as he walked out onto Broadway. "We have nowhere left to go but up." The Gilded Age and the Imperial City. The Civil War came and went, leaving New York wealthier and more corrupt than ever before. The city was now a financial titan, a place of robber barons, Tammany Hall politicians, and millions of new immigrants pouring through Castle Garden. Silas was now a senior figure in the architectural community. His son Julian had just returned from Paris, where he had studied at the prestigious École des Beaux-Arts. Julian arrived home with a portfolio filled with elaborate drawings of grand axes, monumental plazas, and opulent theatrical buildings. He looked down upon his father's generation of simple Greek and Gothic revivals. "New York is no longer a provincial port, father," Julian said as they sat in their new office overlooking Madison Square. "It is the capital of the Western world. It needs an architecture that reflects power, luxury, and cosmopolitan sophistication. We must build in the style of the French Renaissance." The era of Beaux-Arts architecture had arrived. It was the architecture of the Gilded Age, characterized by limestone facades, mansard roofs, exuberant sculptures, and a sense of theatrical drama. Silas watched as the old brownstones along Fifth Avenue were torn down by the Vanderbilts, the Astors, and the Fricks to build palatial chateaux that looked as though they had been stolen from the Loire Valley. The ultimate expression of this era was the construction of the new McKim, Mead, and White buildings. Charles McKim, Stanford White, and William Mead became the kings of the city. They designed the Villard houses on Madison Avenue, the Century Association, and eventually, the monumental Washington Square Arch, which replaced the temporary wooden structure Silas had helped build years before. Stanford White was the bright, erratic star of this world. Silas often saw him at Delmonico's, surrounded by artists, actors, and millionaires. White was a man of pure sensation, plastering the city with golden brick, terracotta ornament, and Roman travertine. "Architecture is not just about shelter, Silas," White bellowed during a dinner party, his red hair standing on end. "It's about creating a stage setting for life. It should be gorgeous, seductive, and unforgettable." Julian went to work for McKim, Mead, and White, and through him, Silas got a glimpse of the changing nature of the profession. Architecture was no longer a trade learned on a construction site from a master mason like old Ephraim. It was a corporate enterprise. Offices now employed dozens of draftsmen, specialized engineers, and specification writers. Yet underneath all the Beaux-Arts limestone and marble, A structural revolution was taking place that would soon make these European-style palaces look like ancient. History: the coming of the giants in 1889. Silas, now an old man leaning on a cane, stood at 50 Broadway to look at the construction of the Tower Building, designed by Bradford Gilbert. It was an odd, narrow building, occupying a lot that was only 21 feet wide but over 100 feet deep. To build a traditional masonry structure of that height on such a narrow lot, the lower walls would have had to be so thick that there would be no interior space left for offices. Gilbert's solution was radical. He used a cage of structural steel columns and girders to carry the entire weight of the floors and the exterior walls. The brickwork was no longer a load-bearing wall, it was merely a curtain hung onto the steel frame to keep the weather out. The public was terrified. On days when the wind blew hard off the harbor, crowds gathered on Broadway, waiting for the Tower Building to blow over. Gilbert himself climbed to the top of the steel frame during a gale, holding a plumb line to prove to the police that the building was perfectly stable. "It's a cheat," Silas murmured, though he was secretly filled with awe. A skeleton of iron and steel pretending to be a building of rise to heights that were previously unimaginable. By the turn of the century, the race for the sky was on. Silas lived just long enough to see the completion of the Flatiron Building in 1902. Designed by Chicago architect Daniel Burnham, it occupied the triangular lot where Broadway and Fifth Avenue crossed at 23rd Street. With its steel frame wrapped in a rich limestone and terracotta skin. Modeled after a classical column, divided into a base, a shaft, and a capital, the Flatiron was an aerodynamic marvel. It created such intense downdrafts that policemen had to be stationed on 23rd Street to disperse groups of young men who gathered to watch the wind lift the skirts of passing women, coining the phrase 23 Skidoo. Silas Vance died in the winter of 1905. His life had spanned the journey from the low, classical ruins of the 1835 fire to the threshold of the skyscraper age. On his deathbed, he looked out the window of his home toward Upper Manhattan, where the city was continuing its relentless upward march. "The city is a fever," he told Julian. "Do not try to cure it. Just build it." The cathedrals of commerce. Julian Vance inherited his father's practice, but he quickly realized that the old ways of designing individual buildings were gone. New York was now a metropolis of vertical density, a mountain range of steel and stone. The first decade of the 20th century was defined by a furious battle for the title of world's tallest building. In 1908, the Singer Building on Broadway reached 612 feet. Its slender Beaux-Arts tower, designed by Ernest Flagg, looking like a delicate French tower stretched toward the clouds. It held the title for a mere year before the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company Tower on Madison Avenue soared to 700 feet, its design directly copied from the Campanile of St. Mark's in Venice but scaled up to industrial proportions. But the true masterpiece of this era arrived in 1913, the Woolworth Building. Frank W. Woolworth, the magnate of the five-and-dime store empire, wanted a headquarters that would serve as the ultimate advertisement for his wealth. He had amassed a fortune in nickels and dimes, and he paid for the $13.5 million building entirely in cash. He hired Cass Gilbert, an architect who understood how to combine corporate ambition with artistic grandeur. Gilbert rejected the classical models. He looked back to the Gothic style that Silas had worked on with Richard Upjohn half a century earlier. The result was a 792-foot tower wrapped in a dazzling skin of cream-colored architectural terracotta, adorned with gargoyles' pointed arches, and soaring vertical piers that carried the eye seamlessly from the street to the Gothic crown. On the night of April 24, 1913, President Woodrow Wilson sat in the White House and pressed a button. Instantly, 80,000 electric light bulbs illuminated the Woolworth Building, turning it into a brilliant, glowing shard against the dark New York sky. At the opening ceremony, the eminent clergyman S. Parks Cadman looked up at the magnificent lobby, with its vaulted ceilings covered in glass mosaics, its grand marble staircases, and its humorous caricatures of Woolworth counting his nickels and Gilbert holding a model of the building, and dubbed it the Cathedral of Commerce. It was a perfect description. The corporate titans of New York had replaced the church and the state as the primary patrons of monumental architecture. Their temples were not dedicated to God or democracy, but to the market. However, the Woolworth Building and its neighbors had created an unexpected crisis on the streets below. The skyscrapers were built as straight vertical walls rising directly from the property line. As they grew taller, they turned the narrow streets of Lower Manhattan into dark, sunless canyons. The turning point came with the completion of the Equitable Building at 120 Broadway in 1915. Designed by Ernest Graham, the Equitable was a massive monolithic H-shaped block that rose 40 floors, nearly 540 feet, straight up without a single setback. It cast a permanent 7-acre shadow over the surrounding properties, plunging nearby buildings into artificial darkness, driving down real estate values and choking the air currents. The public outcry was immense. The city realized that if every developer built like the Equitable, Manhattan would become an uninhabitable, dark labyrinth. The response was the Revolutionary Building Zone Resolution of 1916, the world's first comprehensive citywide zoning code. The law was simple but profound. It required buildings to incorporate setbacks. A structure could only rise straight up for a certain distance, determined by the width of the street. Beyond that height, the building had to step back within an imaginary diagonal line drawn from the center of the street, creating a pyramid-like envelope. Architects were initially horrified. They felt their creative freedom had been crushed by bureaucratic geometry. But a brilliant delineator named Hugh Ferris began to publish a series of charcoal drawings that explored the creative possibilities of this new law. Ferris drew massive, mysterious, mountain-like forms emerging from the shadows, showing how the zoning law could create a new kind of romantic, sculptural architecture. "The new law does not restrict us," Ferris wrote. "It invites us to become sculptors of mountain ranges." Out of this regulatory constraint, a completely new architectural style was born, the Art Deco skyscraper. The Jazz Age and the race to the sky. By the late 1920s, New York was drunk on speculative wealth. The stock market was roaring. Jazz music filled the clubs of Harlem, and the city's skyline was about to undergo its most spectacular transformation. Julian Vance's daughter, Clara, was now a young woman, and breaking all family traditions. She had managed to find work as an interior designer and draftswoman in the office of William Van Allen. Van Allen was an eccentric man, a modernist who loved the energy of the machine age. He was locked in a bitter personal rivalry with his former partner, H. Craig Severance. Severance was building the Manhattan Company building at 40 Wall Street, while Van Allen was designing a tower for Walter Chrysler, the automobile tycoon, on 42nd Street and Lexington Avenue. The race for the tallest building in the world had become a personal vendetta between two former friends. Clara spent her days working on the interior details of the Chrysler building. It was an exhilarating time. The soft, historicist styles of the Beaux-Arts and the Gothic were completely dead. The new style, Art Deco, celebrated speed, industry, and modern materials. Instead of classical stone carvings, the Chrysler building was decorated with stylized brickwork representing car wheels, radiator caps with silver wings, and massive eagle gargoyles made of Enduro K2 stainless steel that gleamed like chrome. "We are building a monument to the automobile, Clara," Van Allen would shout, pacing through the office. "It must look like it's moving, even while standing still." As the towers neared completion in late 1929, the competition reached a fever pitch. Severance, watching Van Allen's progress from downtown, added a massive penthouse and a flagpole to 40 Wall Street, bringing his building to a triumphant height of 927 feet. The media declared Severance the winner. The Manhattan Company building was officially the tallest structure on Earth. Van Allen said nothing. He had a secret. Deep inside the fire tower of the Chrysler building, away from the eyes of Severance's spies, Van Allen's crew had spent weeks secretly assembling a 185-foot-long spire made of stainless steel, the Vertex. On October 23, 1929, just days after the stock market began its historic crash, Van Allen struck. In a single, breathless afternoon, the Vertex was hoisted up through the center of the building's roof through a series of derrick cranes. Within 90 minutes, it was bolted into place. Clara stood on the street below, watching as the gleaming steel needle pierced the clouds. The Chrysler building had suddenly jumped to 1,046 feet, completely eclipsing 40 Wall Street. Van Allen had won the race, but his triumph was short-lived. Even as the Chrysler spire was going up, excavation had already begun on a site just a few blocks away, at 34th Street and 5th Avenue, where the old Waldorf Astoria Hotel had been demolished. A group of wealthy financiers led by John J. Raskob and former New York Governor Al Smith had formed a syndicate to build the ultimate skyscraper, the Empire State. Building was a miracle of industrial efficiency. The Great Depression had settled over the country and labor was cheap and desperate. The construction site was run like an assembly line. Steel beams, freshly forged in Pittsburgh, arrived on-site still warm from the mills. A miniature railway system was laid down on each floor to move materials rapidly. The building rose at an incredible rate of 4.5 floors per week. The laborers, including many Mohawk ironworkers who possessed a legendary indifference to heights, walked across narrow steel beams hundreds of feet in the air without safety harnesses. Their figures silhouetted against the sky like mythic gods. In May 1931, less than 20 months after construction began, the Empire State Building opened. It rose 1,250 feet to its mooring mast, which had been optimistically designed as a docking station for dirigibles, though the plan was quickly abandoned after a series of near-disastrous wind tests. It was a bittersweet victory. The building was completed in the depths of the Depression, and there were no tenants to fill its vast interior spaces. For years, New Yorkers called it the Empty State Building, and the lights in its upper floors were kept on solely for appearance. Yet it stood as a symbol of human resilience, a massive limestone and aluminum mountain that defined the image of New York for the rest of the world. The glass box and the destruction of the past following World War II, New York found itself in a completely different architectural universe. The city had escaped the physical destruction of Europe and Asia. It was now the undisputed economic capital of the world, home to the United Nations and the center of the global art market. But the confidence of this era brought a new kind of architectural ideology, the international style. Led by European immigrants like Mies van der Rohe, Walter Gropius, and Le Corbusier, the international style rejected all historicism, all ornament, and all regional identity. They believed that architecture should be pure, rational, and universal. A building should be a machine for living or a skin and bones structure of steel and glass. Clara's son, David Vance, entered the profession in the early 1950s, joining the mega firm of Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill Soame. David's world was one of clean lines, blue line prints, and corporate efficiency. Instead of a solid masonry mass filling the zoning envelope, Lever House was a delicate, shimmering box of green glass and stainless steel, raised up on stilts pilotis over an open public plaza. It looked weightless, hygienic, and profoundly modern. 6 years later, across the street, Mies van der Rohe, along with Philip Johnson, created the ultimate monument of this era, the Seagram Building. David worked as a junior draftsman on the project. He watched in awe as Mies exercised absolute control over every detail. The Seagram Building was a dark, elegant tower of bronze and amber-tinted glass. Because Mies wanted a uniform appearance from the outside, he designed custom window blinds that could only be set in 3 positions, fully open, half open, or fully closed. To highlight the structural frame, Mies attached non-structural bronze I-beams to the exterior skin of the building, a move that modern purists criticized as ornament, but which Mies defended as a necessary expression of the building's inner logic. Less is more, Mies famously said, and for 2 decades New York listened. Park Avenue, once a grand boulevard of stone-faced apartment buildings and hotels, was systematically demolished and replaced by a monotonous row of glass and steel boxes. But this obsession with the new required a terrifying sacrifice, the destruction of the city's architectural heritage. The crisis point arrived in 1963. Down on 32nd Street stood McKim, Mead & White's Pennsylvania Station. Completed in 1910, it was a masterpiece of the Beaux Arts era, a vast pink granite temple of transportation modeled after the Roman baths of Caracalla, featuring a concourse covered by a spectacular canopy of steel and glass. The Pennsylvania Railroad, facing financial ruin due to the rise of commercial aviation and highways, decided to sell the air rights above the station. The grand building was to be demolished, and the tracks pushed underground to make way for a new Madison Square Garden Sports Arena and a drab office complex. A small group of architects, including Philip Johnson and a young preservationist named Jane Jacobs, formed Action Group for Better Architecture and picketed the site. David Vance joined them, standing outside the grand granite columns with a sign that read, "Don't amputate New York." It was too late. The demolition went ahead over the course of 3 years. The magnificent granite columns were broken up and dumped into the meadowlands of New Jersey. The writer Vincent Scully famously remarked on the tragedy, "One entered the city like a god, one now scuttles in like a rat." The destruction of Penn Station shocked the conscience of New York. Out of the rubble of that beautiful building came the Landmarks Preservation Law of 1965. For 3 years, the magnificent granite columns were broken up and dumped into the meadowlands of New Jersey. The writer Vincent Scully famously remarked on the tragedy, "One entered the city like a god, one now scuttles in like a rat." The destruction of Penn Station shocked the conscience of New York. Out of the rubble of that beautiful building came the Landmarks Preservation Law of 1965. For the first time in its history, New York declared that its past had value, that a building could not be destroyed simply because a developer could make more money with a new one. The new law was immediately put to the test when the Penn Central Railroad announced plans to build a massive glass tower designed by Marcel Breuer directly on top of Grand Central Terminal. The Landmarks Preservation Commission stepped in and denied the permit. The case went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. In 1978, in a landmark ruling, the court upheld New York's law. Grand Central was saved, establishing a legal precedent that protected historic architecture across the United States. The megastructures and the postmodern play, while the preservation battles were being fought on the ground. The skyscrapers continued to grow to heights that Silas Vance could never have imagined in his wildest dreams. In the late 1960s, Minoru Yamasaki was commissioned by the Port Authority to design the World Trade Center in Lower Manhattan. Yamasaki faced a daunting challenge: how to build 2 towers that would reach 1,368 feet, providing millions of square feet of office space without filling the skyscrapers continued to grow to heights that Silas Vance could never have imagined in his wildest dreams. In the late 1960s, Minoru Yamasaki was commissioned by the Port Authority to design the World Trade Center in Lower Manhattan. Yamasaki faced a daunting challenge: how to build 2 towers that would reach 1,368 feet, providing millions of square feet of office space without filling the entire site with columns. The solution was a radical structural engineering breakthrough engineered by Leslie Robertson, the tube system. Instead of a dense internal grid of columns, the World Trade Center was designed as a hollow tube formed by closely spaced exterior steel columns, linked by massive steel trusses to a central elevator core. The exterior walls carried both the gravity loads and the lateral wind forces, allowing for completely open, column-free interior floor plates. Construction was an epic undertaking. The excavation required digging a massive hole down to bedrock, creating a bathtub surrounded by a continuous concrete wall to keep the waters of the Hudson River from flooding the site. When the Twin Towers were completed in 1973, they completely altered the balance of the Manhattan skyline. They were immense, minimalist monuments, 2 silver bars that dominated every view of the harbor, a stark manifestation of late 20th century global capitalism. But the absolute rule of the modernist glass box was beginning to crack. Architects were growing tired of the strict, puritanical constraints of less is more. The rebellion came to a head in 1984. With the completion of the AT&T building, now 550 Madison Avenue, designed by Philip Johnson, the very man who had once been the champion of the international style. The AT&T building was a shocking departure. Instead of a flat glass roof, Johnson topped the 37-story pink granite tower with a massive broken pediment that resembled a classic Chippendale highboy cabinet. At its base, he designed an enormous arched entrance reminiscent of a Renaissance palace. The architectural world was thrown into chaos. It was the birth of postmodernism in New York, an era where history, irony, and ornament were allowed back into the city's vocabulary. "We don't have to be boring anymore," Johnson smiled during an interview. "Architecture is a game of memory." For the next 2 decades, the skyline became a playground of different styles. Buildings like the Worldwide Plaza, designed by David Childs, looked back to the brick and limestone setbacks of the 1920s. While buildings like the Lipstick Building by John Burgee played with oval shapes and colorful stone bands. The contemporary horizon, the shards of the 21st century, the turn of the century brought a profound transformation to The city, catalyzed by the tragedy of September 11, 2001. The destruction of the World Trade Center left a deep, bleeding wound in both the physical skyline and the soul of New York. For years, the site Ground Zero was a place of intense ideological debate. What should take its place? A monument, a park, a new commercial center? The resolution was a complex master plan designed by Daniel Libeskind, centered around Michael Arid and Peter Walker's deeply moving 9/11 memorial, reflecting absence, two massive recessed waterfalls filling the footprints of the original towers, surrounded by a forest of white oak trees. Rising above the memorial was One World Trade Center, designed by David Childs of Somme. Reaching a symbolic height of 1,776 feet, the building was a masterclass in contemporary engineering and security. Its base was an unyielding concrete fortress wrapped in prismatic glass panels, while its main body transformed from a square base into 8 isosceles triangles, forming a clean, shimmering spire that restored a sense of closure and strength to the lower Manhattan skyline. But as the 21st century progressed, the center of architectural innovation shifted from lower Manhattan to Midtown and the far west side. In 2019, the city witnessed the opening of Hudson Yards, the largest private real estate development in United States history. Built entirely on top of an active rail yard using a massive concrete platform, Hudson Yards was a city within a city, featuring glass towers by Cone Pedersen Fox, a cultural center called The Shed with a rolling, kinetic roof designed by Diller Scofidio plus Renfro, and Thomas Heatherwick's Vessel, a climbing structure made of interlocking copper-colored staircases. Yet the most astonishing transformation was taking place along the southern edge of Central Park. The emergence of Billionaires Row. A new breed of skyscraper had arrived, the super slender tower. Enabled by advancements in high strength, concrete and structural engineering, and driven by a global demand for ultra-luxury real estate, these buildings occupied tiny footprints but rose to staggering heights. The most extreme example was 111 West 57th Street, designed by SHOP Architects. Built on a lot that was only 60 feet wide, incorporating the historic Steinway Hall at its base, the building rose to 1,428 feet, making it the concrete and structural engineering, and driven by a global demand for ultra-luxury real estate. These buildings occupied tiny footprints but rose to staggering heights. The most extreme example was 111 West 57th Street, designed by SHOP Architects. Built on a lot that was only 60 feet wide, incorporating the historic Steinway Hall at its base, the building rose to 1,428 feet, making it the most slender skyscraper in the world, with a width-to-height ratio of 1:24. Its exterior skin was a breathtaking combination of terracotta panels and bronze filigree, designed to create a play of shadow and light that recalled the classic Art Deco towers of the past, while its feather-like silhouette tapered elegantly into the sky. To prevent the building from swaying dangerously in the high winds, the engineers installed an 80-ton tuned mass damper at its top, a massive pendulum that counteracts the movement of the tower during storms. A few blocks away stood 432 Park Avenue, designed by Rafael Vignali, a perfectly square white concrete grid that rose 1,396 feet, its minimalist form broken only by open, two-story mechanical floors that allowed the wind to pass directly through the building, reducing lateral forces. These towers changed the scale of the city entirely. They cast long, slender shadows across Central Park, prompting a new generation of preservationists and citizens to ask the same questions their ancestors had asked in 1916. Who owns the sky? How much density can an island support? The living canvas today, if you stand on the observation deck of One World Trade Center or walk along the Highline Park, a former elevated industrial railway transformed into a ribbon of public landscape by Diller Scofidio plus Renfro and Piet Oudolf, you can read the entire history of human ambition written in stone, steel and glass. You can see the small, dark spire of Trinity Church, once the king of the harbor, now buried at the bottom of a canyon of stone. You can see the green copper roof of the Woolworth Building, the stainless steel crown of the Chrysler, the majestic mass of the Empire State, and the shimmering blue glass boxes of the mid-century corporate age. New York's architecture has never been about a single style, a single philosophy, or a single master plan. It is a living, breathing stratigraphy of capitalism, democracy, immigrant labor, and individual vanity. It is a city that has been burned to the ground, rebuilt in stone, wrapped in iron, framed in steel, clad in glass, and stretched to the very limits of physics. As the sun sets over the Hudson River, casting a long, golden light through the canyons of Manhattan, the glass walls of the super-slender towers begin to glow like columns of fire. Down on the streets, the jackhammers are already at work tearing down a building from yesterday to prepare the foundations for a building of tomorrow. The machine never stops. The fever never breaks. The story of New York architecture remains, as it always has been, an unfinished masterpiece written against the sky.